Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's Matt Brown here with our webinar series from A3 Management Consulting. And today we're going to be looking at renewable energy in Southeast Asia. Quite a catchy title that has been come up with there. We are, Matt Heling is going to be taking us through this webinar, this presentation, looking at opportunities and some of the issues around renewables in Southeast Asia. We'll touch upon, of course, some of the COVID impacts as well. With that, well, first of all, I should say, actually, if you just flick onto the next slide, Matt, and then again, past the disclaimer, just to say we're going to have some questions at the end if time permits, so please do submit questions. And if you've submitted questions in the registration, or if you submit questions during the webinar that don't get answered at the end, we will come back to you with answers and get in touch, so it's worthwhile doing. And then the slides and also the recording of the webinar are going to be put up on the website, and a link will be sent round to everyone that has attended, so you can, you know, if the sound quality isn't good for you or something, you can always catch up later. I would say yesterday we had a little problem with the sound, and we found that by logging out and logging back in again, it was fixed. I don't think there's any problems today, but if you're having a problem with the sound, you won't hear that, but I think Johnny will type a message saying exactly that, and Johnny is helping with the setup of the webinar and doing a great job with that, so thanks to him. I think only leaves me to say, Matt or Matthew Heling, please take over and take us through the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So today we'll be talking about Southeast Asia renewable energy. I think, as everyone on the webinar is aware, it's an exciting region. Lots happening, lots of growth throughout the region. But although there's commonalities throughout the region, again, lots of growth, a lot of activity in general. It's hot everywhere. Each country is different. Each region is different, and there are unique policies and market structures and opportunities and barriers and challenges in all of the main, well, every country, every region within Southeast Asia. And so within this presentation, we'll be talking about both the high level and sort of regional drivers, as well as many of the detailed issues and country-specific issues, challenges, opportunities that we see. So getting into it now, topic number one is looking at the opportunity of the RE space in Southeast Asia, sort of at a high level. So we will be looking at the region, looking at really four main dimensions. First one being capacity growth. So this includes both top-level demand growth as well as renewable-specific demand and capacity growth. It incorporates things like country-level targets, etc. Support mechanisms, very important and very different throughout the region. Looking at existing programs, future programs, and support, outlook for changes in the future, and so on. Resource economics, that word is a combination of two words, resources and economics. On the resource side, we'll look at the solar and wind resource, and on the economic side, dig a bit into LCOEs, or levelized costs of the focus technologies, also comparing a bit to some competing technologies. Barriers to development, also very important in the region, and also varies quite a bit depending on where you're looking at. Moving to the right of the slide, in terms of scoping this presentation, we'll focus on two technologies, solar PV and onshore wind. And within both of those, we're talking about utility scale, not necessarily focusing on rooftop solar here, and then also not really talking about offshore wind. That's largely because there isn't much either today or really projected for the future, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about. Geography-wise, again, very diverse region. The ASEAN community consists of 10 countries shown in the map there. We're going to focus on basically the biggest five. So Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines. Why is it exciting? You've seen articles. I won't read these, and I could have picked probably 10 or 20 or 100 other ones, but lots happening, lots of growth, lots of potential, and just a rapidly changing environment here. So starting with a high-level view of each market, I show each country on the left, and then the left-hand half of the slide looks at, generally speaking, capacity growth. And then on the right-hand side, I look a bit at the various more qualitative or market or program-related opportunities. So starting with Indonesia, lots of growth, but market really not so strong. We'll dig into a bit into that later. Vietnam, almost as much growth, not quite as big currently, but faster growth actually than Indonesia projected, and relatively good programs and conditions. Some issues with PPA and off-taker, but not being a huge barrier in the end. Thailand, medium growth, historically strong programs, good place to invest. Right now, it's in a bit of a lull. Malaysia, smaller growth, but a strong program currently. And then Philippines, kind of a big question mark in a way, a lot of potential, but things just aren't taking off there so much. So if we look at kind of the overall opportunity, clearly Vietnam is the biggest one, with each other of the 5 countries having some positive and negative elements. Capacity to date and future pipelines. So looking a bit at the numbers regarding historical and projected future renewable energy growth in particular. Focusing first on wind. Wind has grown some over the years. The bigger wind projects and programs historically have been in Thailand, although in Vietnam recently that's been where the action has been. And so you can see more growth in Vietnam in 2019. Total capacity on the right-hand axis there, about 3 gigawatts. And again, mostly Thailand and Vietnam. Looking forward, some opportunities. Vietnam, clearly the big one. We have a projection of 11 gigawatts by 2030. Maybe that's optimistic, but I think the important thing to focus on here is the relative sizes. So if you're looking at onshore wind, it's really Vietnam. Thailand, probably some continued growth, but not certainly as big as Vietnam. And then the other ones, really nothing substantial projected. Lots of opportunity or potential, but not much projected to happen. Moving to solar, things are a bit rosier, both recently and especially going into the future. So again, Thailand has been a leader here, looking at the top diagram in the slide here, with some previous solar programs that paid very well and were very lucrative for investors and developers. They've since slowed down a bit with their solar program, but in the meantime, Vietnam has picked up 5 gigawatts, looking at the axis on the left, in just this past year. Truly an explosion, and in cumulative up to about 11 or so gigawatts in the region. Moving to the bottom diagram, in contrast to wind, where only Vietnam was really projected to have major growth, we see opportunity and likelihood of significant growth across 4 of the 5 countries we're looking at here. So big growth for solar probably in Vietnam, or certainly I'd say for Vietnam and Malaysia, Thailand possibly, Philippines possibly. Indonesia is just sort of a bit of an odd place where there's lots of potential, but just not really much support. Support mechanisms, probably the most interesting and varying and maybe important element of the renewable energy sector across Southeast Asia. So again, looking at the 5 main countries, looking at past and future, both for solar PV and onshore wind. I think kind of to summarize, on the left-hand side, lots of feed-in tariffs were primarily the mechanism for supporting solar in the past, generally speaking with either planned or probable transitions to auctions. We've seen it around the world, of course, and it's not, there are complexities to auctions too. You do get lower prices, but there are also challenges that come with them. But anyway, the ability to attract lower prices is certainly appealing, and so likely things will transition towards that going forward. Notably, I'd say Indonesia and Philippines future solar support remains very unclear and or weak. Both have some kind of high level targets, but not much is really happening for various reasons. As commentary, we see topics about Vietnam, the well-known PPA and curtailment issues, and then elsewhere, I think it's kind of lack of good clarity about what's coming next. Wind, basically similar. Malaysia, no minimal wind resource, as we'll see later, so it's just not really relevant there, but similar plans, market support-wise, going forward for wind. Risks to consider in transactions. So, to some extent, renewable energy is renewable energy around the world, but of course, every region has its unique issues. Here in Southeast Asia, I've listed 3. Those of you who are already involved in transactions here, you know these well, or this is maybe not new to you, but anyway, it's worth mentioning off-taker risk. Utilities here, some are in strong condition and some are known to be good off-takers, but certainly others are not. And so that's a risk that's maybe bigger here than in other places, than in some other places in the world. Having said that, there hasn't been much real, right here, minimal history of non-payments, and that's true, but the risks remain. In some cases, this can be mitigated by seeking government guarantees to support the PPA. We see this happening and available more often for big thermal projects, but conceptually it could apply to renewables as well. Curtailment risk, highlight on Vietnam here. That's probably the biggest investor challenge in Vietnam. Mitigations I show here, one is a do-it-yourself approach where you can add batteries to future projects to mitigate your own risk. Of course, that'll increase your price, but that's something to consider. I think we see more developers thinking about that. We've heard rumors that Vietnam might require that in future solar programs. Certainly not confirmed, but you can start thinking about that. Mitigation number 2, hope the utility figures it out. It's a bit of a half joke, but there isn't much you can do as a developer, right? I think having said that, kind of my personal view is that Vietnam will figure it out. They're aware that curtailment risk is bad for the investor, it's bad for the developer, it's bad for Vietnam. If people are afraid of curtailment risk, they're going to not invest in Vietnam, or there's going to be higher cost of capital and so on. Vietnam, so they're already quite aggressively addressing the existing transmission constraints, and I see that continuing, such that curtailment isn't a major risk in the future. Exchange rate convertibility risk. This is maybe somewhat unique here, depending on terms and availabilities of sort of how and where to convert. It can be difficult to repatriate revenues. Not much you can do about this, probably. Obviously, in concept, anything's open for negotiation, although we found that these terms are harder to negotiate away. Drivers of successful growth, several. Main one being, or one of several being, the resource level. Anybody can find these maps, but the idea is that for solar, it's quite strong throughout the region, but with some variation within each country. So Indonesia, well, really all 5 strong. You can see from the map, Thailand quite strong overall. Malaysia less strong, but everywhere quite good. I say quite good. It's not great. Some of us think of Southeast Asia and we think sun and islands and beautiful warm days, but there's a lot of clouds and rain here. So you're never going to get the high capacity factors that you would get, say, in the Middle East, in Dubai, those areas. So good, but not great. Relatively good throughout the region with some exceptions. Wind resource, I'd say a different story. Overall, not so great. There's a few sort of hotspots of good wind resource, but huge variety, both among countries and within countries. So Malaysia, often considered to have 0 wind potential. Actually, there's some. It's just that the spots are very small and not near load centers. Indonesia, Philippines, also some good resource. Philippines, especially, some very good resource, but again, not so easy to get to or near load centers. Vietnam, quite good resource in the southeast, and in fact, that's enabled a lot of the recent wind development in Vietnam. Thailand, east and north, some spots, but overall not huge entirely. This one I think interesting. So looking at the cost, some high-level LCOE figures. The first thing I want to say is that these are intended to be representative of the region. Each country, and depending on country, depending on technology, depending on probably 1 million other assumptions, you can come up with significantly different numbers. These are intended to be representative and convey some high-level concepts here. So, of course, we have time on the bottom here and looking at LCOE, levelized cost in real terms. A couple things to point out here. One is looking at solar and wind. That's the blue and orange lines. Clearly already competitive with gas, whether it's international, fueled by international LNG or local domestic pipe gas resources. Thing two to mention is the difference between international gas plants fueled by international gas, international LNG, and gas plants fueled by local domestic gas. A lot of the countries here have an advantage or benefit of very low price domestic resources. And so a lot of countries here have used that. Thailand, for example, gas is a major player in terms of the power generation mix. Malaysia, it's strong also. But importantly, and I don't show it here directly, but my point 3 here is that generally speaking, the gas power plant industry is going to be shifting from the black line to the gray line. In other words, from domestic fuel gas sources to international LNG. Many of the countries who currently rely a lot on gas, their domestic supplies are declining, and so we're going to see a transition to higher cost power when it's from gas. So clearly, you've all seen charts showing renewables becoming more and more cost competitive, and over time undercutting thermal competitors. Same thing here. Some unique contexts which are important to point out. I'll say a bit about COVID here also. I also say a bit about it later. Clearly, the short-term impacts are not shown on this slide. Gas prices tend to be linked to Brent prices. Brent prices are currently down through the floor right now. Whatever you think about sort of short-term, medium-term impacts, at least our view is that in general, the long-term fundamentals that drive our long-term projections will more or less hold true. And so if I was going to adjust this slide, I might adjust the first several years, but more or less, the CCGT lines would remain similar. Yep, so I mean, having said that, there will be some reduced thermal costs in the near-term future, making renewables look a little bit less relatively competitive. Other drivers of successful renewable growth, looking here at market structure, power market structure across the countries. I won't go into each country in detail, but quite a range from essentially fully vertically integrated when you look at Thailand and Indonesia, although allowing private generators or IPPs, all the way to Philippines, where it's essentially almost a fully liberalized power market. In between, you have Malaysia and Vietnam, which are both in the middle of a transition in different stages. But that certainly affects how build out and why renewables build out occurs. For the top ones, it's much more about will the government or regulatory commission provide support, a renewable support program. So it comes from the top down. As we go towards liberalization, it can come more from the bottom up. Sort of related, we see developments in, for example, Vietnam about DPPAs. The D is escaping me, but basically corporate PPAs, PPAs with others than the main off-taker. So things like that are emerging here, although it's certainly slower than elsewhere in the world. We took a lot of the information we showed you and that we sort of thought about separately and attempted to come up with our view of what are the most attractive opportunities currently within the scope of wind and solar utility scale among the countries that we've been talking about. So, you know, easy to come up with other permutations here, but in our view, clearly Vietnam is number one. Maybe that's obvious, but it's just the case, both for solar and wind. Huge capacity growth, both recently and projected into the future. Support mechanisms, not perfect. There's issue if we consider PPA as part of that. That's not perfect, but historically good feed-in tariffs and good programs in general. Resource economics, again, this sort of combines relative economics of wind and solar, well, compared to their competitors, as well as the relative resource. So it's relatively high for Vietnam, partly because Vietnam has a lot of coal power. So their power is relatively less expensive. But that'll be changing in the future as there's more dependence on imported LNG, for example. Malaysia, not maybe the sexiest one. Their solar program is going well. It's very, we think, moderately and prudently done. They're not overextending themselves, but they're continuing to draw in solar projects and investments, and that is expected to continue. Overall, capacity of Malaysia is not growing very rapidly, a few percent per year compared to the 7-ish% per year for, say, Vietnam. But again, the support mechanism in terms of the program is quite strong, and then resource economics kind of a middle area there. So near term, that's where the action is. But we say keep an eye on solar really in all of Indonesia, Thailand, and Philippines, all for similar but slightly different reasons. So Indonesia, just huge growth. It's 250 million people, fourth biggest country in the world. They're going to need more and more power. Currently, a lot of that power comes from coal, but when you look at the just growth in demand, as well as possible additional future pressure on closing coal stations, there's a big energy gap there that something needs to fill, and solar can be a big part of it. Support mechanism, zero. In fact, the current support mechanism now is basically it simply limits the maximum compensation to a solar project based on a rate that is essentially similar to the cost of coal power. Resource economics, so as a result, solar doesn't look as good economically. Both the relative cost of power it's competing with is relatively low. And since there hasn't been much solar development there aren't so many kind of learning effects bringing down prices there. Thailand, a bit different. Historically strong player in solar, good programs, good support, pretty good resources, moderate growth in demand, but right now it's basically taking a break. I think some people think that it still feels a bit of pain from the very strong and lucrative renewables programs it offered in the past, and probably is waiting for costs to come down yet further and then jump back on the bandwagon. I'll also note that Thailand currently has significant overcapacity. They've built huge numbers of gas plants in the past couple of years or in progress. And so there isn't simply too much need for new power in the near term. Philippines, again, a bit of a question mark. Pretty big capacity growth expected overall, but support for renewables has historically lagged or been weak. Broadly speaking, there's no view that will change significantly soon. Although, as with Indonesia, I didn't mention it yet, but governments, of course, there, but especially there, have an important role in all of this. And so, should there be significant government change, then maybe the priority that's given to renewable energy will increase. Again, I have not mentioned offshore wind. That's because it doesn't really exist in Southeast Asia, and it isn't projected to exist much, except for Vietnam. So just a couple of comments here. One, it's new, so that takes time for Vietnam. Two, it's competing with Vietnam's generation mix, which has quite a bit of coal and hydro, which is low cost. So offshore wind is relatively more expensive compared to those, and then not so near load centers. So some concluding remarks. I see I have just a few minutes here. COVID, mentioned a bit about it in the LCOE slide. Clearly it's impacting electricity demand here, and how electricity demand returns depends, of course, on economic activity. What does it mean for the renewable energy sector? Near-term supply chain disruption, which means can projects meet deadlines? For example, deadlines to be eligible for feed-in tariffs. Financing ability can be impacted. Off-taker risk can be impacted as well. You know, the utilities that especially are already not profitable are going to be in a worse condition with reduced electricity sales. So that becomes more of a risk. Longer term, question mark. New capacity, reduced demand, possibly. We'll see how things rebound. And then in any case, I guess that partly relates to the next one, which is depending on whether fuel prices recover, then the relative economics of renewables may look different. Having said that, in terms of M&A, good news is sort of as valuable as bad news in that this bad news is still driving a lot of transactions. And maybe people are selling instead of buying, but on the other side, a seller is a buyer. So transactions are still happening. We'll see how much that continues to happen. And then possibly increased interest in sustainability, broadly speaking. So not necessarily in solar per se, but generally interest in looking at more sustainable solutions. Batteries, I also haven't mentioned. Generally, more wind and solar in the region means more need for flexibility to balance the intermittency. Batteries increasingly attractive, but we think growth in batteries will continue to lag the rest of the world here in Southeast Asia. Well, in line with the top-down regulation comments I mentioned earlier, same thing for batteries. Batteries will only be procured or a program will be created if somebody who's in charge of doing that is convinced or has an idea that that's what they should do. Far less opportunity for the bottoms-up, ground-up, organic development of battery projects here. Okay, so a bit of a summary of everything. Project developments, solar and wind capacity are growing, projects are happening, various different stages, and transactions, M&A activity happening here as well. But when evaluating those opportunities, the devil really is in the details. Every region unique, every country unique, lots of different elements to consider. And so it's important to have good insight into all of those in each country that you're looking at. Cost reduction, locational factors, good resource level, but good sites can be hard to find and or not near load centers. Impact on relative cost effectiveness from COVID due to lower thermal fuel prices. We'll see how that affects the relative economics of renewables. Key risks, talk about off-taker, PPA and curtailment, convertibility, et cetera. Those are a bit unique to Southeast Asia. And obviously, how will COVID affect the industry more broadly? So almost at end of time, I'll just give a quick plug about what we do, generally speaking. So I lead the team covering most of Asia. I'm based in Thailand. We do a lot of work related to both qualitative and quantitative market analysis. So what you've seen here has been more qualitative, looking at programs and policies. We also do on the quantitative side, price projections, tariff projections, using our market model that we also deploy elsewhere in the world, the company does. Lots of other topics basically regarding power and gas markets and economics. And finally, complementing our team here in the region, actually it's a very big technical team in the energy space. We're working across all power generation technologies and doing a whole variety of technical engineering consulting services. Big contributions across the company to power projects around the world, and certainly in Southeast Asia as well. So that's it. feel free to contact me or my team or Matt with any questions about these topics. You see my email there, and AFRI will continue to be doing webinars like this. Next week, my colleague Brendan Cronin will talk about the Middle East electricity sector, focusing on coronavirus and low oil prices. Also, Thursday next week, and you see there the link to sign up. So that's what I have. I hope it's been interesting to you. And looks like we're at about 4:30 already, so I'm not sure I'll have time to answer questions, but why don't I let Matt wrap it up for us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. Very interesting. Good to see things still happening across Southeast Asia. Just to say also, we have a team in China who are analysing the Chinese markets, and we're going to be doing a webinar, I think, beginning of May, covering our latest analysis in China. You can also see there that we are having a webinar debrief popped up. It's the troubles with working in remotely with one screen when you need two, isn't it? It's something we're all facing in these unusual conditions. There is one question, Matt, just a clarification that's come in, if you could answer that quickly, and that is the solar PV figures that you've shown. Do they include rooftop solar, or is it just utility scale? And I think the answer is it's just utility scale, but maybe you could just confirm.
You are correct.
Excellent. Okay, so hopefully we've answered that one. And thank you very much for joining our webinar, and we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.